people, taking your complex ideas about creating sustainability and a future for everyone that is environmentally sound, and turning that into a campaign or communication strategy that works to actually change behavior.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. And just to start, my name is Michael Levine, and I'm the owner of a company in Montpelier called Flywheel Communication. Can everybody hear me? Yes. And basically what I do is help nonprofit organizations and small businesses tell their story. And that takes on a lot of different realms. Some of it's print, some of it's multimedia, some of it is media training for getting out into interview situations, but able to tell their story concisely. And a lot of it is involving, before anybody ever goes into a studio, coming up with a communications plan and a very clear and concise message that they're trying to deliver. Some of you may have had the opportunity to hear people interviewing and you go, wow, they are so sharp and just so on point. And then others will take 15 minutes and ramble, and you go like, I don't know what they were talking about. And the difference is how much forethought goes into that. So that's some of what I help people with. And the question, of course, is how do I do it? And I like to say I release the power of words, because words really matter, and they count for a lot. It's not as simple as it seems, but in many ways it really is. One of the things that I did years ago was working with the USDA. And at the time they were having and they still do this, of course, research with organic farmers. This was probably right at the beginning of the research of the extension agents. And the extension agents were filing these great reports, and the scientists were filing these great reports for their peers. But none of the organic farmers, or the would-be organic farmers, or the consumers were able to access any of this information. Even if the report was printed, people would look at it and have no idea what it was saying. So my work there was actually to translate that inner speak into a language that people could actually benefit from. And this is the kind of work that goes on all the time. And it's exactly what this conference has been about, and I think that's part of why you're all here today, to figure out how to do this. So the challenge is that the researchers represented at this conference are working on cutting-edge issues, incredibly complex research, and using terms that most people have no idea what they're talking about. And it's not a formula for broad-based action. You know, and that's really seems to be kind of the driving force of the conference and this movement now, is how do we get from talking to ourselves, identifying these issues, and getting people to take action. Well, this isn't working. So what are we going to do about it? Or why isn't it working? That's the first question. It's not working because it's not easy for the mainstream media, who are busy with 1,000 stories a day, to come and pick through these papers and try to figure out where the nuggets of useful information are. And it's hard for grassroots groups. So you've got these people on the ground who really want to move things ahead, but they also can't get their head around this to give a message to their core followers. Research is just years ahead of most Americans' knowledge, and we have to bridge the gap. We have to bridge the gap because until people know the answers to these questions, they're not going to get motivated to do anything. So the researchers are identifying problems that nobody even knows are problems. And then they're saying, well, here's the solution, but unless you know there's a problem, the solution is irrelevant. So then, how are you going to promote these new ideas? How do you introduce them into the public arena? And it really does take a campaign. And you can think of a campaign in lots of ways. You can think of it in political campaigns, you can think of it in advertising campaigns. Really, they're not that different. You're just trying to get a clear, concise message to people that they can understand and act on. So what is that going to do? It's going to simplify the message, but it also isn't going to water down the message to the point where it's irrelevant. Each one has to still be saying something distinctive. You want to break it down to more common language, and this is something that I was reading about on the blog and also hearing even this morning. This idea of storytelling is becoming more and more important because that's what people are going to relate to, whether it's in their own town or whether it's halfway around the world. It's the stories that illustrate getting from point A to point B. So you also want to describe the future you want so that people can see where you're trying to get to, and then develop those real action steps that are going to engage people, rather than just having them sit back and listen passively and say, oh, that's nice, and then go on with whatever. You want to engage them, raise the awareness, and then they can go out and make a difference. So let me give you one example of something I was involved in. It was a little quiz. Okay? How do you describe the intersection of recording studios, historical societies, software designers, jewelers, community development, cultural diversity, tourism, and innovation? If you don't have to answer, just think. Okay? How would you do that? And the answer is the creative economy. Very short phrase, encompasses all those ideas. And back about 10 years ago, this term was really known to only a handful of people. It started outside of the US, and then it sort of trickled in. And I was involved in a project here in Vermont to introduce this term statewide. And it was really kind of fascinating because the term captured people's imaginations, and it gave them a big enough umbrella that a lot of disparate groups suddenly found themselves comfortable under this term. And they talked about it, they talked to each other for the first time quite often. This was chambers of commerce and arts groups and filmmakers and all these different private sector, public sector, and nonprofit groups. They talked about investing in it, and over time, they've had a lot of success in actually reviving their communities through this idea. It was launched by the Vermont Council on Rural Development. And part of how we got the message out there is holding public forums regionally around the state. And not only going there and sort of inviting people to a meeting, but working with local business and cultural groups to actually host these things. So we had a local interest and a local participation right from the get-go. And people started to have ownership of this. Then we met with editorial boards, developed ongoing news coverage in print, radio, TV. Don't forget the importance of public access as a community vehicle. We organized letters to the editor. We did op-eds. I mean, it was across the board. And this was really before social media. So, of course, that piece will get added on at this point. But basically, you can't just do one thing or two things. You've got to operate on all these different levels. And then the report that came out of it made specific recommendations to policy leaders and gathered compelling statistics. It included anecdotal success stories and offered the online documentation of the whole process. So people felt like they could really pick this up and run with it because they might have been an early adopter, but then how do you convince other people in your community? And they could take this document or a website or whatever it may be and say, look, here's what I'm talking about. So you give them the tools and the language to talk about it consistently, and it starts to resonate. And even now, we're seeing stories all the time in Vermont and nationally about downtown organizations adopting the creative economy as a way to move forward. So words matter. So think about some examples like this that come to mind for you, and we'll be talking about those in just a few minutes. Our contact info is not in the program, but here's where to find me. And one of the things that I did last night was read the talk from the current president of the USSEE, Valerie Lizadas. That's how her name is pronounced? Is that right? Lizadas, okay. And I think she's got this. So she says, it's time to pay attention to what we do want, not how to avoid what we don't want. So think positively. And then she went on to say the great transformation to a society, I don't know if this is her term, the great transformation, or something that's common in your field, but she's talking about a great transformation to a society that values and respects each other and the non-human world that is the rest of the planet. Then she goes on to say, this is the key, some of the most powerful shifts of mind were stimulated by stories. Tell yours and listen to others. So that's what we're going to talk about.
Any questions?
I have a question. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to think about it. So, I think we all agree that the environmental message or communication, definitely can be improved in a lot of ways. But it's just one of my, things where I get a little frustrated is just and I'm channeling Rob Williams right now, saying how media owners become more and more consolidated. And they're still giving out the message, I'm thinking about climate change, and they're still giving out the message that it's very scientists don't agree, when we know that 99% of scientists do agree, and that most Americans don't even believe in it, when we know that I think it's actually over 50%. So kind of in the face of all of that, how do we still, I understand you're giving us some tools here, and I appreciate that, but I don't know, do you have any thoughts about the big, it's such a big
Okay, well,
challenge.
first of all, it takes time, right?
But we also have a sense of urgency.
Right, exactly. So the sense of urgency can't trump the need for planning. And I think that's kind of that step back of rather than just putting it out all the time and just assuming people are going to pick up on it and understand it and it's going to replace every other story out there. You have to be more strategic about how that message gets placed, where it gets placed, and the consistency of it is really important.
Hi. So I'm a longtime communications person. I haven't always worked in the nonprofit world. I've spent most of my career in business. And so I've been in nonprofits for about 5 years. The Institute for Sustainable Communities is located in Montpelier. We're about 22 years old, and we've worked in 25 countries. These are the countries we're currently located in. And what we do is we work with local leaders in their communities to help them make the change they want, right? And so when you talk about, the turning to the transformative and turning to what Champlain would describe as appreciative inquiry, using that as the way of answering the question, that's what we do. We do it in countries all around the world. And so we do a lot with peer learning. We do a lot with storytelling. We do a lot with people sharing their stories with each other, especially practitioners. When you are working in the trenches, you need to talk to the other people who are doing this. And that's a big part of our programming. And so I wanted to tell one story. I have my garbage bag, I'm sorry, it clashes. I grabbed the green one. And I was thinking how handy it would be if it really started pouring when I was working here from my car. So we have worked in Serbia for 7 years. And we've done a lot in the post-USSR, post-war-torn, and especially around, we do environmental advocacy. We teach nonprofit leaders how to do environmental advocacy and how to change the conditions in their countries, right? How to make things happen in their countries and change the environment. And so one of the things that's a big deal in Serbia is trash. People dump their trash wherever, and people were really, really feeling frustrated about the fact that no one cared about the environment. People would just throw stuff anywhere. They did not care. And we worked with a group of about 12 leaders from different nonprofits. We formed kind of a little coalition. The Balkans are the Balkans, right? Like, people don't coalesce into coalitions easily. They're always elbows out. It's just a cultural thing. It just tends to be the way people operate there. And so this was unusual. But we did an advocacy fellows program, and we brought a bunch of environmental leaders together. We sent them through some really intense training. It was about an 18-month program. We brought them here to Vermont. We took them around and showed them lots of exciting solid waste things. We took them to the Highfield Center for Composting, and we took them to the Champlain Solid Waste District, and we showed them what's possible in solid waste, which is a passion, you know, for a lot of us. And so when they went back to Serbia, you know, this was stuff they were already working on, but they had a lot of different ideas. And so they did a campaign, you know, just exactly as Michael described, with a lot of grassroots to it, and they did a campaign, and what they figured out through the process of working together, right, these people from different perspectives, was the issue was not just about shaming people for throwing garbage, you know, by the side of the road. The issue was they didn't know where the legal dumps were. And so they printed a website with the information about where was the garbage dump on the garbage bags, and they had an app, and you could just put in where you were, and it would show you where the nearest dump was. And you know, this was a huge, like, unbelievably successful. They did a lot of other work around Serbia, you know, a lot of positive things. They had like, oh, you know, music and dancing, and let's everybody recycle together, and you know, bringing in the cultural, you know, traditional culture, really important when you're doing a campaign. What matters to people, you know, in the United States, it might be rap music, it might not be, you know, the music and dancing you might see in, you know, Thailand, but it's still important to have that represented when you're trying to move, you know, people to action, is recognizing what they value. So I just want you to know, this is just a really visible example of, oh yeah, like this is that at work, right? What do people need to know to change their behavior, to do things differently? You know, did these groups, did they also work at the, you know, at the policy level? Did they work at the national level? Absolutely, right? They did all the things they were supposed to do, but they had very engaging and positive grassroots action that helped people change their behavior without, you know, having it be a hostile situation in a place that was already pretty hostile. So that's just one story. I mean, I've of course got a lot of them, because that's a lot of what we do, is say to people, hey, you're doing this in Chicago, do you know what they're doing in Istanbul? You know, don't do that, is what we say to them. You know, but there's a lot of neat stuff out there, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Rob?
Yeah, just a quick question for you, Liz.
Yeah.
Because I'm just wondering if you could speak for a minute to kind of the cross-cultural challenges or opportunities in terms of storytelling, or maybe you want to say that, I don't know, but I mean, it seems to me you bring a pretty interesting perspective there, and a lot of us are working internationally or working with, you know, international partners.
You know, there's a lot of things that are the same, no matter where you are, right? It is hard. We do a lot of work with city government leaders. It is hard to convince the mayor or the city council, you know, that a new highway is not the answer. That is hard no matter where you are. You know, there's definitely, you know, pieces that are similar. We do a lot to point out the similarities, right? What's the same? Of course, in, you know, North America, people have such resources, it's hard for them to recognize, right, how much they have in terms of resources. And so sometimes, you know, you just kind of remind people of that, you know, that when you're agonizing over, you know, whether or not it would be a business killer, you know, to ban plastic bags or something, you know, in San Francisco, you know, Bangladesh is trying to figure out how to enforce building codes so people don't die, right? Like the scale of the problems, like you know, human lives at stake is so much more dramatic in the United States. It can actually be, in the rest of the world than in the United States. It can actually be kind of helpful to remind people of that, and also to remind people of how far ahead we are, right? In terms of sustainability, in a lot of ways, we are very far ahead. You know, I would say that Europe is farther, you know, but it's still, you know, you're still struggling with people, you know, the same. I mean, we're looking at, you know, we spent a lot of time paying attention to the news coverage and reaching out to colleagues, you know, last week, and, you know, people were dealing, you know, in Germany and Austria with what we're going to deal with here in Vermont, right, about rebuilding. People rebuilt after '92 in places where they shouldn't have, and, you know, they're dealing with it today. And that's, so it's just, you're pointing out the similarities about this, and like, that's what it gives us, right? The access to so many things where you can say, oh, it's just like this in Vietnam, Yeah.
I wanted to mention that we went through the same thing in the United States in the early 60s. I'm old enough to remember that. People used to, before recycling, people used to throw their garbage out the car window. And we had to go through the same thing. And there was a national campaign, some of us that are older might remember, it was Lady Bird Johnson. And the key figure was the Indian actor, remember? With the tear coming out of his eye about the trash. So that was how it was done here. It was a Lady Bird Johnson's issue about not throwing the garbage out your window. And we went through exactly the same thing here.
There was a highway beautification campaign, right, that she ran, along with a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, he was planting flowers.
Yeah, but there was also the Keep America Beautiful
That's it,
campaign,
that's it.
which was an attempt to keep places like Vermont from having bottle bills.
Really?
So that was the Container Corporation of America
Oh, God.
trying to ward off the Oregons and Vermonts of
It
the
was
world.
politically fraught.
Yeah, but there was the fact that they used the Indian, I thought was really culturally specific to here, because at the time there was a whole resurgence of interest in Native Americans. Like right now, maybe it wouldn't work, but at that particular time, it did.
Right, and it always, I think Michael touched on this a little, and, I think Amanda will as well, right? It's about context, right? What is relevant and meaningful to the people we talk to.
So I'm Amanda Levinson, and I work with organizations to leverage technology and design technology for social change, for positive social change. And there are a couple things I could have potentially talked about today, but I think that the one that's in some ways most relevant to this audience is the work that my colleagues and I have been doing around data visualization. And for the past 2 years, I've been working with a project called Visual Budget. And how many of you are using, I assume that most of you are using data in some way with your work, data, numbers, right? So Visual Budget is a project to visualize one of the most, I would say, boring, misunderstood set of numbers in this country, which is the federal budget. But it's also one of the most important policy documents that we have. So our task was to try to make the federal budget not only easy to understand, but interesting, engaging, exciting, not the terms that you would generally use, I don't think, to describe the budget. And this is a screenshot. I would invite you guys to check out the site, because it really is interactive. It's not a static site. It's very dynamic. This is a screenshot, so you can see where the money's coming from, where it's going, how much deficit we have. You can slide this thing at the bottom to see how much it's changed over time, and you can also go several levels into spending. And then we also as well have we have a couple of presentations that walk you through some of the data and really tell the story of income taxes, for example. So because we spent so much time thinking about, and actually the disclaimer here is that I did not actually build any of this technology myself, so I'm not the technologist behind this, but I work with a team of brilliant technologists and actually documentary filmmakers who are bringing their skills to bring this data to life. And so over the past couple years, we've been thinking about, okay, so what are some of the most important principles behind using data to engage people? And we've come up with a few, which we're calling our Engaging Data Manifesto. And I want to share a few of those with you. I'm going to go through it quickly because we don't have a lot of time. But so the first principle is that your data has a story. You need to find what it is and tell it with beautiful graphics in a way that's going to change the world. And the example that I want to give for this is actually data visualization that comes from the mid-1800s. This was Florence Nightingale did this following the Crimean War. And what happened is that Florence Nightingale went into hospitals during the Crimean War caring for soldiers, And what she found out, she was meticulously recording the cause of deaths of soldiers. And what she quickly found out was that most soldiers were not dying from wounds sustained on the battlefield. They were dying from poor hygiene and sanitation in the hospitals. And so following the war, she created a report and a series of data visualizations, which are actually quite beautiful. They're referred to now as it's the coxcomb style of visualizations, in which you can see, so it shows very simply, you know, here's the deaths from wounds in battle, and here are the deaths from communicable diseases in hospitals. And it was really this information that she then shared after the war, which led to hygiene and sanitation measures becoming widespread throughout the British Empire. Yes.
And this was her visual?
Yes, it's her
It's
visual.
like a 19th century infographic?
Yeah, it's a 19th century infographic.
Where'd you find that?
It's on the web.
Oh.
Yeah. You can Google, if you Google Florence Nightingale coxcombs, you can find it.
That's fascinating.
And actually somebody has kind of redone it in this like cool interactive style now, so that's pretty neat too. So the second principle is let your data enable discovery. As human beings, we really like to see data in context and in comparison with other sets of interesting data. And I think that the best example that I can give of this is, are you guys familiar with Hans Rosling? Hans Rosling is kind of the data visualization guru, and he has a website called gapminder.org. He's done TED Talks, and he's really excited about bringing data visualization to life. Gapminder.org is a site that's dedicated to showing the disparities between the developing and the developed world, specifically around education, poverty, health, and what he does is just, again, in a pretty simple way, is able to show the disparities between nations over time through these bubbles, beautiful bubbles that change shape, and you can explore the disparities between, for example, like HIV infection in different countries over time, and a bunch of other things as well. And what it does is when you look at these visualizations, it really invites questions like, okay, so why was there this big drop in HIV infection rate in India between 2008 and 2009? What happened in the economic development of this country to shift the poverty rates, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the second principle. Third, make your data human. And by that, I don't mean to find the human story in the data, but to find a way that connects on a human level with the data that you're presenting. And it doesn't have to be complicated, it can be very simple. And I love this example from the Girl Effect. You look at this, it's a very simple graphic, but immediately you can see that child brides have twice the mortality rate of women in their, twice the pregnancy death rate of women in their 20s, right? Very simple and powerful, and it kind of gets you in the gut too. And then finally, I think this is kind of most important for us, all of us who deal with big numbers, is that big numbers, they really do, they break our brains. We can't, as human beings, we are not wired to we can't understand trillions, we can't understand billions, we can't really understand millions if you think about it, And so it's important to put things in a scale that the human experience can understand. And this is a screenshot from the video that we did in Visual Budget for the average income tax rate. Instead of showing what all Americans pay, the average of all Americans for the income tax rate, what we did is we said, okay, if you take 100 Americans, these are how much the top earners pay. These are how much the bottom earners pay. So you take a representative sampling. And so if you're interested in creating your own data visualizations, you can do it yourself. And there's a lot, because this is such a growing movement almost, and people are really understanding the importance of telling stories through visualizations and through graphics. There are some really neat tools. There's Visually, which is a website where you can get inspiration but also create your own graphics. Tableau Public is a free software that you can use to create simple graphics. Flowing data is just an awesome log of all things visualization. It's like visualization candy, and they curate some really interesting stuff. And then finally, it doesn't have to be complicated. You can do Legos. This is Hans Roslein. He did a short video recently with Legos in which he was showing the disparity in wealth between developed nations and developing nations and carbon footprint actually. So those are just some principles for you guys to think about, and we can talk now or later. So any questions?
Questions for Amanda at this moment? Yes.
Have you seen the graphics that the War Resisters League uses for the national budget? Because they've done some really interesting graphics.
No, I haven't.
Yeah.
The War Resistance League?
War Resisters League, yeah.
War
They have
Resisters
shown,
League?
they've showed the U.S. military, for example, budget compared to the rest of the world combined
Uh-huh.
in bar charts
Yeah.
and separating the Social Security budget from the national, from the
Military?
from the just the income tax budget. So separating those two out and showing different ways. So you might find that interesting because you've done so much work with the federal budget.
Yeah, that sounds like a great example of
Yeah, there it is.
what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's with the Social Security removed
Mhm.
because it's financed separately from income taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an example of what they've done.
Right.
Oh, there's the one on the left, bottom left. You go down further. There's the one. So the red is the U.S. and the gray is everybody else in the world.
Mhm. Nice.
That seems like a helpful visual.
Yeah. Yeah, are we safe? Yeah, we spend more than everybody else in the world.
Right.
And what's good with this is that there's a call to action to it. So I think
Yeah.
one of the things is that it's one thing to present the data, but what is it that you want people to do about it? It's important to present. Yeah, that's great.
So did you work with Ben Cohen on the discretionary, his pie chart on the showing discretionary budget?
No.
How much of that goes to defense and how
No,
much goes to education and natural resources and?
Yeah, no, we haven't.
There's also a sort of a movement for a people's budget campaign from the local to the national level, and it's already going on in, I think, Brazil. And that might be really interesting to tap into as well, where people can go on a website and they can choose their own. You know,
Yeah.
we've done that before with letting people pick how they would distribute the money compared to how the government does it.
That's one of the things that we want to do in the future is to have people be able to build their own budget.
Right.
But really, with an eye toward reducing the deficit and the debt too, and how complex it is and complicated it is to create a balanced budget. And to understand what some of the really wrenching trade-offs are when you have to do that.
They would have to choose the sources of revenue as well as the expenditures,
Exactly.
which is a whole nother
Right,
side.
that's a whole other side.
Right, so you haven't
Yeah.
even tackled that yet.
No.
Right. How are you gonna raise the money?
Right now
Yeah.
we're just on expenditures.
Right, but that would be
Yeah.
really interesting to see
Yeah.
how people would choose not only to spend it, but also how would they raise it?
It would, yeah.
Seems like a relationship with ecological economists would be interesting as well in terms of a lot of these ideas and initiatives that are being shared at conferences like these.
Yeah.
How do you make those sexy visually and,
Particularly GPI.
yeah.
Tons of traction.
Yeah.
I think the other thing
That's
that's
best
interesting
feedback.
about this people's budget is there is embodied in this how to use the information to agitate. Right, so embodied in it is a campaign strategy, a how-to, so people could actually take action easily. Because the key to building a campaign, of course, is that you're not in charge of the campaign, that it has a viral quality to it, and that other people are carrying out the work. So to the extent that you can give people the tools that they need to make that work happen, and make that easy and transparent for them, that's important.
It is important. It's important if you're running a campaign. A visual budget is just an educational tool. So, there's no call to action or anything that's tied to it. We really want people to understand the budget and understand where the expenditures are. And, but for calls to action, absolutely right. Yeah.
Isn't the Workers' Center adopted this as a campaign?
Yeah,
I think they
Okay.
could.
Yeah, they're key.
Yeah.
Right,
They're trying to work on it in Vermont,
right.
and it also ties into the GPI. Because, you know, what are the costs? What's the cost of not doing certain things? And then what are the,
Benefits.
right, and so there's sort of the people's budget's focused a lot on human services, a lot of that. But the GPI obviously is focused on the ecological costs that we don't normally count, the unintended consequences, the cost of unintended consequences. So really those two have a lot in common, and I think mostly because GPI hasn't been publicly ready yet. You know, it's supposed to be in January, and we were thinking about building a campaign around that, because we're working with you guys to do that. So the question is, how do you bring that thinking about how we spend our resources as a state into a fuller discussion that isn't segmented between your GPI indicators and your people's budget indicators. So I think the Workers' Center is interested in that kind of synergy. Sorry, it was an awkward bit, it's late. Rob, would you like to?
So I'll be really brief. I'm really struck by something that Michael said earlier about the importance of words. And I think Amanda reminds us of the importance of images and visuals. And I think, it's like we have and sorry, the handout's just getting mixed together with other things. Very exciting.
That's entirely fine.
That's entirely fine. And so words and images, I think, together, as we all know, are perhaps the most powerful in terms of storytelling. I've been doing on the side in secret. I've been doing some consulting work over the past few years with a number of clients, and I just wanted to share with you just for a couple of minutes, actually what I share with my media and communications students at Champlain College and at University of Vermont. The very first week of class. Are you all familiar with this term convergence? We live in this culture of media convergence. Convergence is sort of an industry buzzword. It just refers to the coming together of different formerly separated media platforms. So, you know, the iPhone is sort of the ultimate example of a convergence technology, because you can watch TV on it, you can watch movies on it, you can read the newspaper on it, you can look at magazines on it, you can actually call people, you can text. Whereas, you know, all those things I just mentioned took place in different parts of the house or different parts of the community, you know, 10 years ago. Like if you wanted to see a movie 10 years ago, you had to go to what was called a theater. Perhaps you've heard of it. Yeah, right. So we live in this world of media convergence where we've taken all the stories that we're telling across multiple media platforms, and we're bringing them to us in very intimate ways, very intimate, powerful ways, really for the first time in human history, and that's both a good thing and a bad thing. There's always trade-offs. So this is really small, sorry. Yeah, you have to have it, of course, right? So in terms of thinking about telling stories, I think the story really matters in terms of the words and the images, and we've talked a lot about that this morning. But I also think we have to recognize that stories ultimately are relational, right? We groove with the story in part because of the storyteller who's telling it. We develop a relationship with the storyteller. Think about, you know, when you're raising kids, if you have kids, and you know, when they're young, you tell them stories, and you share that particular experience of telling the story with them. I'm thinking of channeling Harry Potter, right? I am an 11-year-old, a 14-year-old, and I was lucky to sort of raise my kids through the sort of growing up years with, you know, reading every single Harry Potter book, at least 2 dozen times. And I just put them all on the shelf a few months ago because my kids are too old, they say, now, for Harry Potter. And it was a little sad, right? Because those stories were so much a part of our experience together for years and years and years. So when we tell the story of our organization or our initiative or our idea or our program, and we want to not just raise consciousness, but we want to pull people into participating in that story, I think we have to recognize the importance of relationships in addition to the importance of the story. So how do we do that? So I'm just curious, how many of you are sort of involved in the world of sort of media production on a regular basis? I'm guessing most of you probably are. And I don't just mean social media now, but I mean sort of, I love what Michael said earlier about that creative economy example. And Gary, I have to tell, can I tell this real quick? So Gary leans over to me after you finish presenting that, and he says, I didn't realize that was a PR campaign. And I said, well, that's good because the best PR is invisible, right? But you guys clearly did your homework in terms of deploying the story in a relational kind of way in communities all over the state. And I think that's a powerful example of what we're talking about. So I'm talking about social media here, but really, more generally, I think we're just talking about how do you deploy stories across multiple media platforms over time in a way that's going to be powerful and relational. Yeah. So I just did a quick ABC, and I'll just blow through these because we won't have time to talk. So the A in my ABCs of media convergence refers to two action verbs. One is to assess the actual, and the second A is to authentically anchor yourself. And by anchor yourself, I mean put yourself in the world of media convergence in a way that is authentic for you. Maybe it's not Facebook. Maybe it's not Twitter. Maybe it's a blog. Maybe it's writing, for print in your local newspaper, whatever it may be. But put yourself in play, or put your organization in play consistently in a way that's authentic for you, and allows you to really sort of figure out, as the question says here, who you are and what you have to offer the world. That's the A. So the B stands for balance and belief. Balance the actual and the virtual. We all know, we can all tell stories of Facebook addiction, right? We live in a very powerful media world right now where it's hard to sometimes separate the real from the virtual. Yeah. So figure out how to balance your time, your organization's time and energy. And figure out how you can best sort of believe in your voice as an organization, and again, keep putting that out there in a way that's authentic and that speaks to the work that you're doing. Letter C is really important. C stands for capturing information, training information to find you. When I work with students, one of the first questions I ask them is, how many of you are using RSS, really simple syndication? And very few of them raise their hands, which I find astonishing. Right? If you don't know what RSS is, it's the single most important tool, I think, in the new media convergence toolkit.
You didn't label it, but isn't it fourth one down there?
Yes. Here's the universal RSS symbol right here. Yeah. And there's interesting, I don't know if we can talk about this, but Google actually just announced that they're discontinuing their Google Reader for RSS, which takes effect July 1, which is a huge kind of interesting shift in terms of how information is shared these days. But anyway, RSS allows you, if you don't know, to subscribe to websites and then have new content sent to you directly through what's called an RSS reader. If you use Mac, it's Newsfire maybe, or use Google Reader. But this allows you to listen and watch and observe other organizational stories as they unfold and keep track of relevant information for your work in your initiatives without having to remind yourself to go out to those places all the time. I RSS CCTV because I love them, right? And they're doing amazing work. So I'm always sort of up to date when I check my reader about what they're up to. So capturing information and training information to find you is really a critical task in terms of telling your own story. Watch your competitors, RSS them, see what they're doing. Keep an eye on those mainstream economists, right? You ecological economists, keep an eye on those mainstream economists, right? Letter D is about delivering your story to the Web 2.0 world. And again, be authentic here. I think we've talked a fair bit about this already. As you're doing that, letter E, engage the web community and build a network. Find people in your network who are in alliance with you in some way. There's a number of people in this room who I've gotten to know through various circles, and I find myself keeping an eye on what it is that they're doing and offering support when I can and vice versa. That's what we mean by building this, engaging this community, building a network. Find your friends, letter F, and letter G, grow whatever it is you're doing, your initiative, and remember the authentic, and the importance of balance. And we can talk about these all day, but I'll stop there. I have to give credit where credit's due. I did develop these with a very dear friend who was Champlain College librarian, coolest librarian I've ever met, Sarah Cohen. She was snapped up by a university in California and has since moved west as of a year ago, but she helped me think through these. So I'll stop there. And are you doing something?
I am. I'm
Yeah, I hope so. I'm gonna sit down. Oh, yeah.
Question?
I was
Yeah.
unfurling. I'll come
Was
back
you
up.
just facilitating or? Oh, I hope you're doing something. Yeah.
There's two symbols on there, I don't know,
Oh, yeah.
there's the four squares and then the plus, what are those two?
Yeah, this is, anyone know what this is?
Square.
It's actually not what you would think. This is actually a tagging program called Delicious, which librarians love. It allows you to meta tag data and share it via the internet. Is Delicious still in play? I think so.
Oh my gosh, my whole trip to Turkey is.
This Delicious.
Most of Belgium's life is on
Yeah,
Delicious.
yeah. What was the other one?
The plus,
The Plus, anybody? Yeah.
what is it?
Google Plus.
Google Plus. In the future for dinosaurs like me, you
Yeah.
might want to label these, because we don't know what they are.
Yes, Google Plus.
Delicious is basically bookmarking in a cloud. So instead of, when you find a website that you like and you bookmark it on your computer, Delicious enables you to bookmark it up there. So no matter where you are, you can access them. And what's really interesting about it is that, I'll just show you, just because it's a good tool, just and then we can talk, but I'm an early adopter of Delicious and I love it. But I can't type on this, sorry.
You can also tag stuff in Delicious and then send it to lots of different people.
So you can tag it. So you say, all right, I'm going on a trip, or I'm interested in a presentation on communication strategy. So you find a website that you like, and then you tag, you bring Delicious down into the top of your bar, and then you click on it, and it says, do you want to tag this? And you say yes, and there's the address, you put a little description. And then you can say, what is this? Is this about economics? Is this about ecology? Is this about you can use a hashtag for it, right? So you know what a hashtag is, right? Is this about, whatever it's about. Now, if you hashtag it, it gets sucked into whatever hashtag aggregator there is for an event. So
They do tell Internet Explorer, at the bottom.
do I have to think? Okay.
You might guess.
So that not only would you have a conference like this, where people are tweeting, and they're saying, come to this workshop, because it's really good, right? Then it would appear. But you could also, the photos that you do from photo, what's the photo service?
Flickr.
Flickr, right? So you put a little tag on the Flickr and say, this is from the UUEE, right? And then you have bookmarks. So we've named all these interesting sites, and you would Delicious tag them, and you would put the little hashtag on them. And so all of the proceedings of this event can be viewed in one aggregator, right? The pictures, the comments, the resources. Pretty powerful, yes.
So what you're saying is, anywhere you go, whichever tool you happen to have with you, you can access these bookmarks. You don't have to have the tool that you bookmarked it on.
Right, so I'm
Right.
accessing mine, although it's not accessing them. Anyway, for some reason, there we go, here it is, that's good. These are not my personal ones. My personal ones are up here, but this is a whole bunch of people, other people. And what's also interesting is you can find out what's important to a whole bunch of people. So, if you go to the front page of Delicious, you can see what they're all talking about. Now, because I'm interested in Turkey, right, I can see what all these other people have been tagging and thinking about related to Turkey. You see what I'm saying? So you kind of get sort of a good crowdsourced idea of what's happening out there in the world. My demonstration is beyond me. It's an interesting tool to explore, but let's not get bogged down in tools. Let's kind of go back to that initial question that you had about how does a concept that is powerful and has greatest implications as global warming rise to consciousness and actually be acted upon, as opposed to be stalled by forces. You know, people are very sophisticated with media, managing the media message. I mean, as you said, if more than half the people in this country care about it, why are we not acting on it with more alacrity? You can dissect that, and you can say, well, what are the forces against solving the global warming problem? What are they doing that's so effective? Maybe we can dissect that. Or is there another question that someone in the room would like to talk about? Yeah.
Yeah, something of a corollary question to that. Big issue that I've noticed comes from sort of a systemic national issue where there's a lack of education in the sciences, and that you have so many adults. I've spoken to people twice my age who don't have an inkling of the basic scientific understanding that I do, and then trying to have any kind of socio-political, economic, environmental conversation with them gets really held up when I try to explain something like common property rights, that if you cut down a tree, the air that it produces belongs to everyone, the carbon sequestration that it yields belongs to everyone, and somebody who doesn't understand basic science just won't listen to me because of that barrier. And I see that as being an issue that is, like I said before, so systemic because it comes from the education system that's failing in this country. And I'm wondering how we can overcome such a systemic barrier using media.
So I'll just take a shot at that. Like, one thing I would suggest that you read George Lakoff. You know,
LAKOFF.
LAKOFF, right?
Don't think of an elephant.
Don't think of an elephant, right? Because you just put the frame up. This is a huge frame, right? Around common, you know, the commons versus property rights. And this is a huge, huge issue with all this stuff, right? That's why we run into a lot of this. Because someone says, you can't tell me to do this with my land, right? Like, what, you know, we work on is sustainable development. We run up against something, you know, we are supportive of the UN principle called Agenda 21, which is, you know, you just Google that, you will find some awesome, awesome arguments about how the UN is trying to ruin the world. So, just to give you an idea, right? But that's what it runs up against, this belief. You know, this was not science, right? Like, that was taught to people my age. What they were taught was that your land is your land. And my father was taught that, and his father, though his father was a peasant and didn't have it. You know, so that you're running right into the frame instead of the fact, right?
I think that's a great recommendation, Liz. It's a really good book, that elephant book. And the thing I just add to that too is that, you know, in terms of being authentic with your message, professors are guilty of this, scientists are guilty of this. We try and sort of out-wonk the other side. You know, it's like, I'm going to wrestle you to the floor with data. And it sort of speaks to what you were saying earlier, Matt, about don't scare people with big numbers, right? People respond authentically, not just to rational argument. We are creatures of emotion, human beings, as well as reason. And I think when people sense that you're coming from a really genuine place, that you care deeply about what it is that you're saying, beyond kind of the facts and figures of it, then they will respond to you in kind. And I think that's what I was trying to say earlier when I was talking about, you know, be authentic. Don't just try and out-wonk them, but say, look, you know, in whatever way works, you know, is going to be authentic for you. This really matters, and here's why.
You know, one thing that occurs to me is the ingrained cultural inertia that we have to overcome. So what does that song say? It says, this land is your land, this land is my land. It doesn't say this land is our land. So, I mean, that's the starting point of the kind of way you have to think about the change that you have to put people through.
But it does say this land belongs to you and me, so that is
You
And
and
I
me.
think a lot of the people that you would be saying, this land is our land, they would say, no, this land is my land.
Yeah, well, no, that's my point.
Yeah.
Is that the song doesn't talk about our land. It doesn't talk about the commons. It talks about your land and my land, and that's where we draw the line. So don't come to me and talk about hours.
And there is a new documentary film, which I'm sure some of you have seen, called, right, This Land is Our Land, about the Commons, put out by
David
Media.
Bollier.
Yeah, Media Education Foundation. It came out a year or two ago. And it's the only video resource I know, speaking of film, that actually presents the idea of the Commons in an acceptable, yeah, there it is, an accessible way. We need more of that. I
But
would
it's
argue.
also, to speak to your other point, like Michael talked about campaigns, and in a lot of ways, they all start the same, and it is true, you have to start with like stakeholders, right, and understanding who is it that you need to convince to change their mind. And I usually put that, I do a lot of political work on the side, and I usually put that into who gets screwed, right, by this, right, and who am I screwing, like if the way I want things to happen, goes forward. And so the person who is cutting down their tree, what is it? What are they cutting down their tree for, right? Do they need the money? Is it like in Vietnam, right? Like you have people who are cutting down trees because they need to grow. Because they need to grow crops. Because rice is not growing because of the salinization of the water, right? So they're cutting down the trees. Short-sighted, yes. Train wreck, environmentally, absolutely. But they need to eat. And so you have to understand why are they doing what they're doing. And also understanding who can you influence and who can't, right? The people that you can't influence, you have to find proxies for them, right? Who will they listen to? And that's why, when you're looking at changing behavior, it's looking at those cultural icons, right? Like Lady Bird Johnson making this her campaign, or people who say, like, what is it? It's Snoop Lion, right? I'm a little old now. So like who is, who needs to matter, right? Who needs to speak to this that matter to them, right? When we talk about Vermont, if I do something, it doesn't matter. If Ernie Pomerleau puts up a lot of solar panels, he's a big developer, that matters to a lot of people, right? Like and that's why you need to have public and private. And you need to get the unexpected speaker, the person who everyone would think would disagree with you, who's on your side, and has his or her own reasons for doing it. And those can be public, like people use them in campaigns, they can speak in ads, whatever, but people who are unexpected and represent your point of view in their own language. And that's a big way to go past this head-to-head confrontation, because that doesn't get anywhere. Then just people get dug in.
I think about Burr Morse, who runs Morse Farm in Montpelier, who's like a millionth generation Vermonter, and the 350.org climate change folks enlisted his storytelling support to tell the story about climate change from a traditional, paleo-conservative Vermonter sugar maker perspective, and having his voice in the mix, surrounded by Bill McKibben and all these kind of enviro wonks from Middlebury, was really powerful, because it was like, oh yeah, here's another kind of person in Vermont who is offering this same window into this problem.
Similarly, in Vermont, we had wind farm wind along the ridgeline in Lowell, and a lot of the people opposing that brought in Stephen Wright, who had been a former commissioner of Fish and Wildlife, and so most of them were NIMBYs, they was in their backyard, or it would affect their view, or they didn't want to see the red flashing light that had to be, because of FAA regulations. But then Steve was opposed primarily because of bear habitat destruction, even though it was somewhat temporary while they were blasting for the bases for those wind generators. But they made him kind of a good spokesperson for the anti-wind, unlikely kind of person you would think.
And they took that section of the wind farm off, right, and they just did it in, was it Sheffield or something, like, one town, like, just voted against it, they didn't get any turbines, right?
Right, well, I mean, Lowell finished it.
Oh.
It did, all the Lowell did go through.
Did it?
They're up and running and generating all the electricity.
Because there's another one where one town voted for it, the other one voted against it, and then they didn't get
I know
it.
what you mean up in
I forget which one that was.
I want to just talk about another just resource around. There's a couple of folks here who work, on the college level and with behavior change. One of the things is looking at what technology can solve behavior-wise, right? Where people don't have to make a conscious choice. I'm not saying the temperature in this room is working for us, but essentially the way the data center is built, we're not supposed to touch it. You know, like it's much their work for us and we don't have to think about it. And that's things like lights turning on automatically when somebody walks in the room. You know, and a lot of times for young people, if you can just automate some of those things, then it's not a choice.
Yeah.
I guess I'm having an interesting response to some of this. For one thing, the hair on the back of my neck is thinking that sometimes. And one of the things, I spend a lot of time trying to get my students' faces out of digital media and to actually look around and see the world. I happen to have a tremendous resource, and that's my farm.
Right.
And I can take those students up, and the first thing I tell them is I'm not trying to make you farmers, and I'm not trying to save you. In fact, the only person I'm trying to save is myself. And you're welcome to listen or not. If you can't listen, be quiet. Okay, that's all I want you to do. But then look out on that field, and you see these white woolies. What do you say? What are they? They're sheep. And what are they doing? They're eating grass. What is the grass? It's a solar collector. It's a great big solar panel. It's a panel that is, and what do the sheep do? They're taking the collected solar energy and they're mowing the lawn. They're solar-powered lawnmowers, okay? And they are producing food, and they're fertilizing the lawn. And I haven't spent a nickel on fossil fuels. Now look at my solar panels. I haven't paid an electric bill in 2 years, okay? You know, and that's, and you know, by the time you get into the kitchen and start baking bread, put their hands in dough. And so they're doing something in the real world rather than the virtual world. At least 2 or 3 of them, every semester, have carried that process forward. One person said, my mother from India taught me how to make naan bread, but I never made naan bread, and I'm going to learn how to make naan. And it's changed their culture a little bit at a time. And I think the media, right, they're really important. But it is so important, I think, to get people's faces out of the media and hands in the dirt. Because that's the most convincing argument for sustainability.
Rob's got it.
Have you harnessed any of those stories that you just shared with us?
Yeah, I do that all the time because you know you can talk to a student, you can give students data and show them biogeochemistry and everything, and they will remember it exactly as long as it takes until the next exam. But if I tell them about the story about how I was being chased by pirates in the Arabian Sea on a U.S. research vessel, that's a whole different area. Or what it takes to slaughter a lamb, and how that changes the genetics of the flock. I mean, you know, how, you know, 33% of my flock was killed by parasites, and so we don't use pesticides or anti-helminthics, because that actually protects the parasites against anti-helminthics. And so, and they get those stories, and those they remember at least, I would say, at least 2 weeks after the exam.
Well, I guess my only point in asking you that is, those stories that you just shared about your students on farm,
Yes.
it'd be wonderful to bottle those and deploy those via digital media, not because we want to keep our hands on digital media,
Right.
but because it's about balance. You're taking the experiential education that you're offering them at the farm, and then or someone else is bottling those and deploying those stories as resources in this conversation.
What I would hope is that somehow you know, what we're doing right now is we're experiencing a revolution in electronic media, and that's really incredible. If we can learn to handle that power in a way that makes the world more real and less virtual, I think that really would help. It would promote any message, but it certainly would promote the message that the world is an important place.
Yeah, Gary, I'll say, I totally agree. You know, even though I work a lot with social media, I'm totally split, especially personally. I mean, I hate the fact that social media is basically a tool for tracking everything we do, and trying to avoid it for that reason alone. But then I also see the power of it.
Yeah.
As you said, it's really a revolution. It's all in your phone now. And so how do you use those tools to our advantage and not just to become more, as And exactly, I think that's right.
And I think at the core, what we're talking about for cultural change boils down to an organizing strategy. And the organizing strategy is based on a network-centric approach where we build bigger and bigger circles of relationships. But we're starting with relationship building. And we're using electronic media to amplify the message. Because to have just a strategy that's based only on electronic media is a hollow strategy, right? It has to be built on this actual electricity passing between human beings.
And that's, yeah, I think that's this, you know, when you walk around campus and everybody is, you know, like this.
It's very discouraging.
Yeah, and what's encouraging is when they get out of the cars at the farm, not a single cell phone is out of them. They're all looking around. And what you actually notice is that, you know, they're all walking around with their shoulders up. And at the farm, the shoulders are down, they're relaxed. They're talking, and my wife pointed out, when they sit down, we have a big lunch that they make, and they're talking to each other. And there isn't a cell phone in the place. They're not even ringing. And nothing is going on except interpersonal interaction.
And that's the unit of transformational change.
It is.
Everyone sitting around the table together eating, really. Yes.
When somebody mentioned like the dual nature of this digital revolution, the really good and the really bad parts of it. I think in Julian Assange's book, he talks about how it has terrible implications, like the NSA tracking everybody versus the revolutions in the Middle East. But I wanted to share with you a similar story. I mean, I listened to Chris Hedges, and he says, get your face out of your visual hallucination and get out there and do something. And he says that people think that they can go online and do a blog and they're going to change the world. No, they have to, get out there physically with their bodies. And I have a similar experience. I teach sailing and do sailing trips in the summer, and young people get on my boat. I try to get them to leave their cell phones, but some of them will sit there for 3 hours with the wind in their face and the waves and everything, and they'll sit there texting the entire time. And that just drives me nuts.
Yeah.
And I
Do you throw them in the sea?
I threaten to throw their phones in the sea. And, I think it's a real danger. People are so trapped in their little visual hallucinations and they're not engaged in the world. And I think that's a terrible drawback of the whole digital thing.
I think it's really about charting a middle course, so where technology is an absolute, it's not obsolete either. And I think in Vermont, you see the kind of those two poles at play, right? You see like Champlain College, right, very wired campus. You see people who are very focused on technology and the digital revolution and maximizing that. And then there's also, Vermont is one of the strongest like Luddite cultures. People are like very, we don't want to be on communities that don't want to be on Front Porch Forum. They don't, they're not interested in the broadband. And I think that, we are living in this age of the digital revolution, and the reality is that our relationship with technology in these schools is only going to deepen over the coming years. And so it's not, I think that what matters is not that these tools exist, but it's how we use them, because the tools are neutral, they're just neutral. And it's like a hammer, you can use a hammer to build a house or to
Break down a house.
Right, break down a house. So I think that charting that middle path, and it's very hard to do, and also in a way that makes us more human rather than less human. And I don't actually buy this argument, but Sergey Brin was talking about Root of Glass, which is the new technology, and he said that the whole impetus behind it is to get people out of being hunched over like this and being able to see the world like this, albeit with a screen.
Yeah, they used interestingly, they used a Louis C.K. joke to justify that about parents who go to their children's dance recitals and hold up, the entire time they're watching the recital through a camcorder lens, and the joke that he has is, put the camera down, your kids have better resolution in real life. And I think it's hilarious that he was purposely, trying to make humor of it. And when I read the big press release and the big first interview with Google Glass people, I was actually about to bring this up before you mentioned it. They used that joke as an impetus of their entire concept. that this technology isn't going away. We better embrace it in a way that at least brings about more engagement and instead rather than less.
I think that's it, is we're at a stage in history where we're getting the technology, but we haven't quite learned how to control it yet.
And it's controlling us.
It has the potential to control
I'm
us.
gonna, we're at 10, so I'm just maybe gonna ask Rob to just sum up and then get more of the ladies of these materials. Rob?
Raise your hand if you've learned something. Oh, good, excellent. Just to maybe wrap us up, I think it's really important for us to model early and often and as publicly as possible our ambivalence about everything we've talked about in terms of new digital technology. There are always, in any media experience, there are good things that happen and there are bad things that happen. And I think we've touched on that quite a bit today. But I think it's important for us as leaders in our communities, our schools, wherever we are, our families for sure, just to make clear that, you know, we are not necessarily okay with all of these new technological and communications changes, but we will harness them, as you said, in ways that make us more human, and in ways that balance as best we can, you know, the trade-offs of living in these worlds and continue to tell the stories that we believe in.